It was not a loud alarm, it was a single line of text on my console, blinking in the low amber light of the conclave observation deck. 3 words. From the relay station near the Aldrin Belt, contact lost Meridian convoy. I read it twice, then I set the cup down very carefully because my hand had started to shake. My name is Kale Morrow. I had spent 11 years as a human diplomatic attaché aboard the Galactic Conclave Station, a place the size of a small moon that floated at the center of known space. Like a jewel in a spider's web, every registered species sent representatives. Here there were beings with 4 arms, and beings with none, beings that communicated through color shifts in their skin, and beings so old that their original home worlds no longer existed. I had learned to eat food I could not name, to bow in 17 different ways, depending on who was in the room, and to speak 6 galactic trade languages without making mouth sounds that got humans laughed at. In their first decade of membership, 11 years, and I had grown used to being small here. Humanity was 80 years into its membership with the Conclave. That was not very long. The Felkai had been members for 6,000 years. The Vorkai Dominion, an insected empire of cold intelligence and colder intentions, had been here for 3,000. We were newcomers, and newcomers were expected to be quiet, to learn, and to be grateful that no one had decided to remove them. The thing that kept everyone in line was called the sacred rule. Every species in the Conclave knew it. Every child of every registered civilization was taught it before they learned anything else about galactic politics. The rule was simple: no registered member species may launch an unprovoked military strike against another registered species. Consequences for breaking it were automatic and total. Every other member of the Conclave was obligated to respond with force. The offending civilization would be blockaded, sanctioned, and if they continued, dismantled. It had never come to that last part. In 4,000 years, no one had been foolish enough to test it. The rule was the reason the galaxy had peace, not kindness, not shared values, not mutual respect, just one line of law, and the certainty of consequences. I had always found some comfort in it. The second message arrived 40 seconds after the first. This one was not a single line. The Meridian convoy had consisted of 3 civilian transport vessels carrying settlers and supplies to a new colony on the edge of human register spaces near the Aldrin Belt. 41,217 people, families, engineers, farmers, a full medical team, and a school cohort of 300 children who had been promised better life on a new world. The message told me that all 3 ships had been destroyed, not disabled, not boarded, destroyed. The Vorkai Dominion had been pushing into human war space for nearly 2 years by that point, making claimed that certain resource-rich systems had been incorrectly registered to humanity in the original surveys. Their argument was technical, layered, procedural language, and backed by nothing. I had raised it formally in the Conclave chamber 8 times. Each time I was heard politely, and then advised that border disputes required a joint survey commission, which would take between 15 and 30 years to convene and complete. I had been told to be patient. I had been told that these things moved slowly. I had been told twice by senior Thelkai advisors that humanity needed to understand the Difference between a genuine threat and a negotiating position. I had filed 22 formal objections. I had spoken to every ambassador willing to give me 20 minutes. I had written a detailed report on Vorkai territorial expansion patterns and submitted it to the Conclave Security Committee, where it sat unread. I had done everything correctly, and 41,000 people were gone. I left the observation deck and walked to the main diplomatic hall. It was the middle of the Conclave's rest cycle, so the corridors were mostly empty, lit in the soft blue that the station used at night. My footsteps were very loud. I remember thinking that was strange. Everything felt very clear and very quiet in a way that I had only experienced once before when I was 17. And I watched my brother get pulled out of a collapsed building back on Earth. Time moves differently in those moments. Everything sharp, everything slow. The duty officer at the communication desk was a young man named Owen, barely 2 years into his posting. He looked up when I came in, and his face told me he had already seen the full report. How many confirmed? I asked. All 3 ships, Owen said. No survivors recovered. The Vorkai are claiming the convoy was operating in restricted space. There is no restricted space in the Aldrin Belt, I said. That is human registered territory. I know. He said. They fired on civilian transport vessels. I know, he said. Again, his voice was very quiet. I stood there for a moment. I looked at the screen behind him, at the coordinates, at the ship registrations of vessels that no longer existed. Get me Ambassador Liera of the Thelkai, I said. Tonight, I do not care what cycle it is for her. Owen nodded and turned to his console. I sat down in one of the waiting chairs because my legs had decided they were done holding me up for a moment. I pressed my palms flat on my knees and looked at the floor. The station hummed around me, enormous and indifferent, carrying the representatives of 200 civilizations through the dark between the stars. I had been small here for 11 years. I had been polite. I had been patient. I had filed my reports and made my arguments and trusted that the structure around me would function the way it was supposed to function. Ambassador Liera agreed to see me in 1 hour. When I entered her chamber, she was already seated, and her expression told me she had read the report too. The Thelki were tall and pale, with large dark eyes that reflected light in layers like deep water. Liera had been a diplomat for longer than humanity had known space travel. She was not unkind. She had always been one of the few senior ambassadors who treated me as something more than a curiosity. Kale, she said, and her voice carried something I had not expected. It was not sympathy exactly. It was closer to dread. They used military vessels, I said, against civilian transports in registered human space. This is not a border dispute, Ambassador. This is a violation of the sacred rule. She was quiet for a moment. The Vorkai will argue that the territory was disputed. The argument does not matter, I said. The registration stands until a survey commission rules otherwise. They knew that. They fired anyway. Another silence. Liera looked at me with those deep layered eyes, and I saw something move through them. Not clear's throat. Disagreement. Something else. I will bring it to the Security Committee in the morning session, she said. With what recommendation? I asked. She folded her hands in her lap. with a recommendation for a formal investigation and a call for the Vorka to provide an accounting of events. I heard those words and I understood them: an investigation, an accounting, the same machinery that had processed my 22 objections and my unread report, the same measured pace that had been burning through the last 2 years while the Vorka edged closer and closer to a line that everyone pretended did not exist. How long will that take? I asked. She did not answer immediately. Ambassador Liera, I said. 41,000 people. No, she said. I thanked her for her time, because I had spent 11 years learning to do that no matter what, and I walked back out into the blue corridor. I stood alone for a moment in the quiet of the station's night cycle, and I thought about those 3 ships. I thought about the school cohort. I thought about the settlers who had packed everything they owned into containers and strapped their children into berths and had gone to sleep trusting that the registered route was safe. I thought about the sacred rule and how the galaxy had kept it perfectly for 4,000 years, and in how a civilization 3,000 years older and vastly larger than ours had looked at that rule, looked at us, and decided we did not count. Something settled in me then. It was not anger. Exactly. Anger is hot and loud. This was different. This was cold and very, very clear. It was the feeling of a decision being made at some level below conscious thought, the way a ship's autopilot switches over when the pilot goes down. I went back to my quarters and I sent a single encrypted message to the Earth diplomatic office marked for the attention of the director. It said, they did it. The rule is broken. We are not filing a form. Then I sat on the edge of my bunk in the dark and I waited for morning. Outside the window, the stars were very bright and very still, and the galaxy went on turning as if nothing had changed. It had not yet learned that everything had. 2 weeks after I sent that message, I was recalled to Earth. The official reason given to the conclave was a routine consultation. Nobody questioned it. Humans were recalled for routine consultations all the time. We were a small, unremarkable species with a single star system and a handful of colonies, and nobody tracked our comings and goings the way they tracked the movements of Telkai cruisers or Vorkai fleet rotations. That was the first thing Director Clara Osmond said to me when I stepped into the briefing room beneath the new Geneva governmental complex. They stopped watching us, she said. That was their first mistake. Clara was 61 years old, short, with gray hair cut close to her head and eyes that made you feel she had already thought of everything you were about to say and had moved on. She had run Earth's Diplomatic Intelligence Division for 16 years. I had reported to her for most of my career, but had only met her in person 3 times. She poured 2 cups of coffee from the machine on the side table, handed one to me without asking, and sat down. The Conclave Security Committee, I said. What is their position? An investigation has been opened, she said. Estimated timeline to preliminary findings 18 months. I looked at my coffee and the Vorkai. They have issued a formal statement describing the Meridian convoy as an unlicensed intrusion into a disputed zone. They have also filed a counter grievance claiming that human survey equipment was damaging their claimed territory. She paused. The counter grievance was filed 48 hours after the convoy was destroyed. The audacity of it was almost impressive. They are going to bury it in procedure, I said. They are going to try, Clara said, and under normal circumstances they might have succeeded. The conclave moves slowly. Small species get ignored. We have known that since we arrived. She set down her cup and looked at me steadily. But they made a mistake, Kale, a significant one. They assumed we would respond the way every other small species responds when a larger power does something like this, which is by grieving quietly and accepting reality. She stood up and walked to the door. Come with me. We went deeper into the complex, down 3 levels in a lift that required her handprint at every floor. The air changed as we descended, becoming cooler and drier. The walls changed from standard government composite to something older and heavier. When the lift doors opened, we stepped into a corridor lit in white, and at the end of it was a door that required both her handprint and a spoken code. Beyond the door was a room that I was not prepared for. It was a war room, not a planning room, not a crisis management center. War room, fully active with displays covering every wall and 40 people working at stations in controlled, quiet focus. There were orbital models of the Vorkai Dominion. There were fleet compositions, resource maps, communication intercept summaries, and tactical assessments. There were names and faces I recognized from Earth's Defense Council, alongside names I did not know from branches of the military I had not known were this large. I stopped walking. How long has this been here? I asked. This specific room? 14 years, Clara said. Program it represents considerably longer. I turned to look at her. We have been preparing for this. We have been preparing for the possibility of this, she said. There is a difference. We hoped the rule would hold, but we are human, KL. We study history, we read patterns. And when you look at the history of every small species that joined the conclave and then disappeared from it, the pattern is not subtle. She walked me to display showing a timeline. Small civilizations registered and protected by the sacred rule, 18 of them over 3,000 years, every one of them gone, absorbed or erased, and in every case the process had begun with a border dispute followed by a slow procedural response from the conclave, followed by nothing. The rule protects the powerful, I said slowly, because the powerful enforce it, and when the target is small enough, no one enforces anything. Exactly, Clara said. So we made a decision about 40 years ago that if this ever happened to us, we would not wait for enforcement. We would be the enforcement. I in that room for a long time, looking at the displays, listening to the quiet, focused activity around me. A man named Adrian Holt, who turned out to be the director of Earth's Combined Strategic Command, came over and introduced himself. He was younger than I expected, calm in the way that competent people are calm when they have been planning for something long enough that they are no longer afraid of it. We have been running simulations on the Vorkai for 11 years, Adrian said, walking me through the tactical display. Their command structure is hive consensus-based. Decisions cascade from a central intelligence node outward. It makes them extraordinarily efficient in predictable scenarios. He paused, and extraordinarily fragile in unpredictable ones. They have never fought humans, I said. They have never fought anyone who does not follow galactic standard tactical doctrine, he said. Every species in the Conclave has been fighting the same way for 2,000 years. There is an accepted vocabulary of warfare, established formations, recognized signals for ceasefire, understood escalation sequences. He looked at me with a calm that was somehow more unsettling than anger would have been. We did not learn to fight from the galactic vocabulary. We learn from ourselves, 10,000 years of our own conflicts, our own adaptations, our own doctrine. It is completely foreign to them. Foreign how? I asked. He considered the question. When a Vorkai fleet engages an enemy, they model the enemy's decision tree and select the optimal counter at each branch. It works perfectly against every opponent they have ever faced. The problem is that humans do not follow a decision tree. We follow our instincts, our emotions, our training, and sometimes something that cannot be modeled at all. He pulled up a battle simulation. We ran the scenario 40,000 times. Our commanders make decisions the Vorkai cannot predict in 73% of engagements. That number gets higher as the fight goes on. I was quiet for a moment. Outside the Conclave station, I had spent 11 years being the small, polite representative of an unremarkable species. I had smiled and bowed and chosen my words carefully and accepted being ignored and dismissed and talked over. I had done it because it was my job and because I believed in the slow machinery of diplomacy. But standing in that room, looking at those displays, I understood something that shifted the ground under my feet. We had not been small because we were weak. We had been small because we had chosen to be while we prepared. What do you need from me? I asked. Clara stepped up beside me. The Conclave is going to move slowly. We know that. We are not going to wait for them, but we need the legal ground to be clear when this is over, and that means we need someone inside the Conclave making the argument on record. At every step, we need the galaxy to understand that what the Vorkai did was a breach of the sacred rule, that we raised it correctly, that we were ignored, and that our response was therefore not aggression but consequence. You want me to go back? I said. We want you to go back as a full ambassador. This time, she said, not an attaché. You will have the authority to speak for Earth directly. I nodded slowly. Through the wall of displays I could see the star charts, the fleet positions, the long patient preparation of people who had decided that if the day came they would be ready. 41,000 names sat in my chest like stones, and I breathed around them. When does it start? I asked. It already has, Adrian said. He pulled up a live feed from a relay near the Aldrin Belt. One of our patrol vessels, a mid-sized craft named the Resolute, had been surrounded by a Vorkai intercept squadron 3 days ago. The Vorkai had expected it to stop, to power down, to wait for a boarding party. Instead, the Resolute had done something no galactic tactical simulation had ever produced. Its captain, a woman named Iris Calloway, had cut 2 engines deliberately, spinning the ship into a controlled tumble that made it look crippled and impossible to navigate, and then used the tumble itself as cover to bring its rear firing array into alignment with the lead Vorkai vessel's drive section. 3 Vorkai ships had broken off. One had not moved fast enough. Resolute had come home with a scratch along its port side and one less External sensor array. I watched the replay in silence. Iris Calloway, said commander formerly of Earth's Deep Range Exploration Division. Adrian said she learned that tumble maneuver from watching asteroids break apart in high gravity fields. She had been thinking about using it for years. I thought about the Vork-I commanders, watching their simulation screens as the Resolute began to tumble, watching every model they had scream impossible, watching a human being do something their entire strategic database said could not work. They did not know what to do with her. I said, they still do not, Adrian said quietly, and that is only the beginning. I flew back to the Conclave station. The next morning, I had a new title, new credentials, and a weight in my chest that had not been there before. Not fear, not grief, though that was still there too. Something else, the particular weight of a person who has been handed something important and intends to carry it correctly. The station looked the same as always. When my shuttle docked, the same sweeping corridors, the same mix of species, the same faint hum of the environmental systems that kept 200 civilizations breathing, but something was different. I was different. I had spent 11 years learning to be politely small in this place. I was done with that now. I walked to the main diplomatic registry and formally submitted my upgraded credentials. The clerk, a Thelka Jr. officer, looked at them with mild surprise. Ambassador Marrow, she said. It was the first time anyone on the station had said that word in front of my name. Yes, I said. I walked to my new ARC office, which was 3 times the size of my old one, and I sat down at the desk and I pulled up the list of every Conclave ambassador I needed to speak to. There were 41 of them, representing species that had been quietly afraid of the Vork-I for a long time. The galaxy was still turning the way it always had, but somewhere out near the Aldrin Belt, a human commander with a scratch on her ship was flying home, and somewhere in the prepared depths of Earth's planning, quiet engines were beginning to move. I started writing. The first thing I noticed, sitting in the new office, was that people were coming to me. For 11 years I had gone to them. I had requested meetings and waited for responses and followed up politely when responses did not come. It was the natural order of things for a small species. You went to the powerful. The powerful did not come to you. But on the 3rd morning after my return to the station, I arrived at my office to find 3 messages waiting, one from the Peloran Collective, a mid-sized species that had been nervously quiet during the Vork-I border provocations, one from the Serena Assembly, whose territory ran along the outer edge of the Vork-I Dominion and who had twice, as in the last century, been on the receiving end of Vork-I territorial pressure, and one from Ambassador Davin of the Arisi, a species so old and so careful that they had not opened a communication with a human representative in 40 years. I read all 3 before my coffee finished brewing. Then I called Owen, who was still on duty in the communications room, because Owen was always on duty, and I asked him to clear my schedule. For how long? He asked. Indefinitely, I said. I saw the Peloran ambassador first. His name was Ren, and he was nervous in the particular way of someone who has wanted to say something for a long time and is only now allowing himself to say it. He was a compact being with 6 fingers on each hand and large, mobile Ears that moved constantly, tracking. Sound from every direction. He sat across from me and looked at me for a long moment before speaking. We want to know what you are doing, he said. Earth, what you are actually doing. We are responding to a violation of the sacred rule, I said. His ears rotated forward. The Volkai have made violations before, he said, against us. 30 years ago, we filed in the conclave. Nothing happened. I know, I said. So we want to know what is different. This time, I looked at him for a moment. I thought about Clara in that room and Adrian and his displays and Iris Calloway tumbling through space with nothing but instinct and 11 years of watching asteroids. What is different, I said carefully, is that we are not filing. Ren's ears went flat against his head and then slowly, very slowly forward again. The Serene, he said, they want to speak to you too. I know, I said. I will see them at midday. The meeting with the Serene Assembly's representative, a tall woman named Petra Venn, who had been in the conclave longer than me, was more direct. She came in, sat down, folded her hands and said, "We are going to formally invoke the sacred rule against the Volkai Dominion. We have a record of 2 incidents in the last century. We were waiting to see if anyone else would move first." Why? I asked. Because, she said, small species do not move first. It is how we survive. I nodded. When will you file? When I leave this room, she said. If you tell me, it will not be ignored. I met her eyes. It will not be ignored, I said. She stood up, nodded once and left. Out in the wider station, things were moving that I could not see from my office but could feel. The way you feel a change in pressure before a storm. Signals were traveling faster than I could track. In the Vorkai diplomatic wing, I later learned, Ambassador had not slept in 4 days. Their intelligence analysts were running models that kept producing outputs their system flagged as errors because the outputs were impossible according to every strategic framework they possessed. The impossible outputs were called Iris Calloway and a dozen others like her. I need to tell you about what was happening in the Aldrin Belt because my story was only one thread of it, and the thread out there was pulling tighter. 12 days after the Meridian Conclave, Vorkai advanced squadron of 9 vessels moved into the Aldrin Belt with orders to secure the region and establish a forward position in what they were formally calling disputed space. They expected to find a human patrol presence, overwhelm it quickly, and be in control of the belt before the Conclave's investigative committee had scheduled its first meeting. What they found instead was Commander Owen Farr. Owen Farr was not a famous name. He was not a celebrated officer. He was 43 years old, from a coastal city in the north of England, and he had spent 17 years in Earth's deep-range defense division doing the kind of quiet, unglamorous work that nobody paid attention to. He commanded a small response group of 4 vessels, each one lighter and faster than any Vork warship in the squadron. When the Vorkai squadron entered the belt, Farr's group was already inside it, positioned not at the obvious defensive points that any standard tactical model would place them, but deep among a field of dense metallic asteroids that made sensor readings unreliable. The Vorkai squadron moved in standard formation. They swept the area with long-range sensors. They found nothing. Their models told them the zone was clear. Owen Farr had put all 4 of his ships in a slow drift that matched the rotation of the asteroid field to the Vorkai sensors. They looked exactly like rocks. He waited until the Vorkai formation had fully committed to its entry path until the squadron was spread across a corridor with limited room to maneuver. And then all 4 human ships fired simultaneously at the sensor arrays and communication antennae of the 2 lead vessels. They did not aim at the drives, not at the weapon systems. They aimed at the eyes and the voice. The 2 lead Vorkai ships went sensor blind in the same second. The Hive consensus model that ran Vorkai tactical decisions required constant communication between vessels. When the 2 lead ships went quiet, the 7 remaining ships experienced what Adrian had described to me as a cascade failure of the decision structure. They were not programmed to act independently. Their doctrine did not include the concept of a commander making a choice without confirmation from the chain. Far's 4 ships were already repositioning. By the time the Vorka squadron had reestablished partial communication and attempted a response, 2 more of their vessels had their navigation systems disabled by targeted precision strikes. The remaining 5 retreated. Not one human vessel was destroyed. Not one human life was lost. I received the battle report in my office between the Peloran meeting and a scheduled address to the security committee. I read it twice. Then I set it down and looked out my window at the stars. The thing that stayed with me was not the result. It was the method. Every species in the conclave that had a military had it structured around the same principles. Central command established formations, recognized signals, predictable escalation. It was a language, a shared language of conflict that had developed over millennia, because when everyone speaks the same language, wars are manageable. Owen Farr had not spoken that language. Iris Calloway had not spoken it. They had spoken something older, something built from 10,000 years of humans fighting other humans, from every failed strategy and every desperate improvisation, and every moment when a cornered person had to invent something new or stop existing. The Vorkai had no vocabulary for it. Their entire strategic database was full of entries that began with the words "enemy will respond by" and ended with a predictable range of options. There was no entry that said "enemy will drift silently through an asteroid field for 6 hours, disguised as rocks, and then destroy your communications." There was no entry for human stubbornness, no entry for the particular way humans refuse to accept that a situation is over just because the numbers say it is, no entry for the person who is losing and decides calmly to change the rules of the game entirely. I had a meeting with the security committee that afternoon, and for the first time in 11 years on that station, I walked into that chamber, and I was not dismissed before I had finished speaking. Ambassador Davin of the Oracy was already there, which was extraordinary. The Oracy sent observers to committee meetings, but they never sat at the table. Davin was seated at the table, with 3 of his staff behind him, and his ancient face showed an expression I could not fully read. I presented our case clearly and without decoration. The Meridian convoy, the coordinates, the vessel registrations, the timeline of my 22 prior objections, the Vorkai's formal response, and the legal position under The sacred rule, I did not raise my voice, I did not appeal to emotion, I laid out the facts in sequence and let them sit. When I finished, the Vorkai ambassador, a being named Kyrak, whose translated name roughly meant second calculation, attempted the argument that the territory was disputed. Davin interrupted him. That was also extraordinary. The territory registration stands until a commission rules otherwise, Davarian said in a voice that carried the specific weight of someone who has seen empire come and go and is choosing to spend that weight now. The ambassador's legal position is correct. The room was very quiet. Petrovisan filed the serene assembly's formal invocation of the sacred rule against the Vorkai dominion. Ran of the Pelurin collective filed a supporting declaration. The security committee chair, Athelkai Sr., named Varin, who had previously been one of the people urging me to be patient, called for an emergency vote on recognition of the violation. The vote passed by 14-3. After the meeting, Kyrak found me in the corridor. He was tall with a smooth exoskeletal face that showed no readable expression, but his translator unit carried a tone that was flat in a way I had learned meant concern. Ambassador Morrow, he said, your government's actions in the Aldrin Belt will be considered hostile. Are our government's actions in Aldrin Belt, I said, are a direct and proportional response to the destruction of civilian vessels in registered human space under the sacred rule. I paused, which your dominion violated on record. In front of the entire committee, he was quiet for a moment. The dominion does not lose extended engagements, he said. It was not a threat exactly. It was something more like a statement of fact, a reminder, the kind of thing you say to a small species to make sure they understand the shape of the world. I had heard things like that for 11 years. Neither do we, I said. I walked back to my office and opened a channel to Clara. The rule has been formally recognized as violated, I told her. I know, she said. Adrian is watching the committee feed. The Vorkai ambassador implied they would continue. Yes, she said. What do we have near the belt right now? She was quiet for a moment, and I heard the sound of her setting something down on a desk. Enough, she said. Tell me. 22 vessels of various classes, most of them retrofitted deep ships, plus Owen Farr's group, which is already in position. A pause. Also, a wing of the new fast attack ships that you do not have clearance to know about yet. Despite everything, I almost smiled. How fast are they? Faster than anything the Vorkai has on their charts, Clara said. We built them small, and we built them quiet, and we have been testing them in the outer belt for 2 years. The Vorkai's intelligence on our fleet is based on their survey data from a decade ago. Because they stopped watching us, I said. Because they stopped watching us, she agreed. I looked at the star charts on my display. The Aldrin Belt was a bright cluster of light in the middle distance, small and ordinary looking, and somewhere inside it Owen Farr was repositioning his ships, and Iris Calloway was probably running new calculations on the next impossible, thinking she was going to attempt. Galaxy outside my window had not changed its shape. The conclave station hummed along in its patient orbit. 200 civilizations went on with their business, their trade routes, and their council sessions, and their ancient slow diplomacy. But a gear had turned. Something had Engaged that could not be disengaged. I had one more message to send that evening. It went to every ambassador I had spoken to in the last 3 days. It was short and professional and said simply that the formal proceedings were now in motion, that the legal ground was clear, and that any species wishing to formally align with the human position under the sacred rule should do so within the next 72 hours. 12 species responded before I had finished my dinner. I sat in my office long after the lights shifted to the sustained night cycle. The coffee was cold again. I did not mind. I thought about 41,000 names. I thought about Owen far drifting in the dark, patient and invisible. I thought about Petra Vinfin standing up from her chair and filing without hesitation the moment I told her it would not be ignored. I had told her the truth. We were not going to let it be ignored. Outside in the corridor, I could hear the soft hum of the station and faintly, somewhere, the sound of steps moving with purpose through the blue-lit dark. The Vorkai had broken the one rule the galaxy lived by. They had assumed we were too small to matter. They were learning slowly that small is not the same as harmless, and patient is not the same as passive. I turned off my lamp and went to work. The ceasefire request came from the Vorkai Dominion on a morning when I had not slept. I was in the middle of a live communication with Adrian's strategic team when Owen sent me a priority flag. I told Adrian to hold and open the flag. The words were formal and precise in the way that Vorkai communication always was. They requested a cessation of hostilities pending diplomatic resolution. They offered to submit the territorial dispute to a neutral commission. They expressed willingness to discuss reparations for what they described as the incident involving the Meridian convoy. I read it twice, then I told Adrian what it said. There was a pause on his end, then he said, "How many of their fleet assets have we disabled in the last 3 weeks?" 41 vessels, I said, with 0 losses on our side. Another pause. Read me the part about reparations again. I read it. They called it an incident, he said. Yes. I said, not a violation, not an attack. No, I see. His tone did not change, but I had learned to read the spaces in Adrian's voice. What does Clara say? I am going to ask her in about 2 minutes, I said, but I wanted your read first. My read, he said slowly, is that they believe they can settle this with language, that if they offer enough procedural concessions, we will accept a diplomatic outcome and go back to being a small species with a grievance on record. He paused again. They still do not understand what they triggered. I called Clara. She was in a meeting but stepped out to take my call. I told her about the request. We expected this, she said. Hive consensus models are very good at cost analysis. When the cost reaches a threshold, the model outputs a de-escalation signal. They have run their numbers and decided that this is the threshold. What are our terms? I asked. We worked them out last week, she said. Are you ready? Tell me. She did. I spent the next 4 hours preparing for the conversation I was about to have. I went over every line of it with care. I spoke to the Serene, the Peloran, and 8 other species who had formally aligned with us, and I told them what was happening and what our position was going to be. Ran of the Peloran collective sat very still when I explained our terms and then said quietly, no one has ever demanded that from the Vorkai before. No, I said. They will consider it extraordinary. He said. It is proportionate, I said. That is different from extraordinary. I met with Chirac in neutral chambers at the midpoint of the station. He came with 4 advisors. I came alone. That itself, I had been told, unsettled them. Their doctrine required mirrored delegation sizes. Coming alone was outside the accepted framework. I sat down, thanked him for the request, and told him our terms. He was quiet for a long time. When I finished, translator unit rendered his response in a flat tone that I had come to recognize as the Vorkai equivalent of genuine surprise. You are not claiming our territory, he said. No, I said. You are not demanding military reparations. No. You want to restructure the enforcement mechanism for the sacred rule, he said. Slowly, with human participation in the oversight body. Yes, I said, and full reparations to the families of the 41,000 people in the Meridian convoy. Individual settlements, not a collective payment, and public acknowledgement, he said on the conclave record. Yes, he was quiet again for a longer time. Outside the chamber windows, the station moved in its long orbit, and the stars were patient and old and indifferent. Why, he finally said. The question surprised me by its simplicity. Why? What? Why not take more? He leaned forward slightly. Your military position is strong. You have coalition support. The conclave vote is in your favor. You have leverage that no species of your size has ever possessed in a proceeding of this nature. His tone held something I had not heard from a Vorkai before, something almost like confusion. Why are you asking for justice instead of power? I thought about the question for a moment. I thought about Owen Farr drifting through the asteroids, about Iris Calloway and her tumble maneuver, about Petra Vin filing without hesitation, about Clara's displays and Adrian's calm and 40 years of quiet preparation. I thought about 41,000 names because we do not want an empire, I said. We want this to never happen again, to us or to anyone else. He studied me for what felt like a long time, then he said something in the Vorkai primary language without waiting for the translator, and one of his advisors looked at him sharply. The translator caught it a few seconds late. It rendered the phrase as approximately. They are more dangerous than we calculated. I chose not to acknowledge that I had heard it. Chirac agreed to take the terms back to the Dominion Central Consensus for consideration. He stood to leave, and at the door he paused without turning around. We did not believe, he said, that you would enforce the rule yourselves. We know. I said, we believed no one would act on your behalf. We know that too, I said. He left. I sat alone in the room. For a while, through the window I could see a section of the station's outer ring, and beyond it the dark between the stars, and somewhere in that dark the Aldrin Belt, and Iris and Owen, and 22 ships and a wing of fast attack vessels that the Vorkai's chart said did not exist. The terms were accepted 6 days later. The formal signing took place in the main conclave chamber in front of representatives from every member species. Chirac signed for the Dominion. I signed for Earth, the Serene and Peloran, and 10 others signed as aligned parties. Clara watched on a live feed from New Geneva. Adrian turned off the display after the vote confirmation and went to get a coffee without saying anything to anyone, which was apparently how he expressed satisfaction. After the signing there was a recess, and the chamber filled with the sounds of hundreds of beings speaking in dozens of languages. I stood at the edge of it for a moment, holding a glass of something the Thelkai served at formal occasions that tasted like carbonated minerals and felt like it was calculating your age from the inside. Ambassador Davian of the Oracy appeared beside me. He was very old, even by the standards of a very old species, and he moved slowly but with complete precision. He had been in the conclave longer than any other serving member. He had watched empires negotiate and dissolve and renegotiate. He looked at me for a moment with his ancient eyes. The new enforcement clause, he said, the co-leadership structure, it will not be popular with the older powers. It will be necessary. I said, yes. He said, that is not the same thing as popular. No, I agreed. He was quiet for a moment. I have been in this chamber for a very long time, Ambassador Moro. I have watched species arrive and disappear. I have watched the rule hold, and I have watched it bend, and I have watched the conclave find ways to look elsewhere when looking elsewhere was easier. He paused. I did not expect this outcome when the Meridian convoy was destroyed. Neither did we, I said, but we were ready for it. He looked at me with an expression that was somewhere between careful assessment and something gentler. Yes, he said slowly, you were you not? He moved away into the crowd, and I stood at the edge of the chamber and looked at the new text on the conclave record that was being formally inscribed into the registry. Even as we stood there, the sacred rule in all 200-member languages, and below it, added for the first time in 4,000 years, a second clause. The second clause established the enforcement body, the response timeline, the coalition obligation. It was dense with procedural language, but at the very end of it, in plain language that the committee had argued about for 3 days before, I simply read them the draft and asked them to find anything incorrect in it. Was a single sentence. It read, this rule was tested once. Cost of testing, it was total. I did not write that sentence to be threatening. I wrote it because it was true, and because every small species that came after us deserved to know it, and every large species deserved to remember it. That evening I sat alone in my office for the last time, with the lights of the station around me and the stars outside the window. I was going home in the morning. Not permanently. I had a new posting to arrange, a new term as ambassador that would involve building the enforcement body from the ground up, which was going to be complicated and slow and difficult in all the ways that diplomacy is always complicated and slow and difficult. But for one evening I sat still. I thought about 41,000 names. I held them for a while. I thought about a 17-year-old version of myself watching a building come down and learning for the first time that the world does not stop when it should. I thought about 11 years of being small and the cold clarity of a decision made at the level below words. I thought about Clara, who had been preparing quietly for 16 years with the patience of someone who understands that readiness is not aggression. About Adrian, who had spent his years running scenarios and building something no one was supposed to see until it was needed. About Owen, far drifting in the dark among the asteroids, calm and invisible and ready. About Iris Calloway, tumbling through space with the instinct of Someone who has never accepted that the numbers are final. I thought about Rin, sitting very still and asking if anyone would actually enforce it this time, and about Petrovin standing up and filing before the door had closed. We had not done this alone, but we had started it. That mattered. Outside my window, the stars were bright and still, in the way they always are, indifferent to everything below them, carrying no memory of what had happened and no concern for what came next. I had spent 11 years looking at those stars and feeling small. I did not feel small now. I felt the weight of 41,000 names and the weight of the work ahead and the very specific, very quiet feeling of a person who has been handed something important and carried it correctly. Tomorrow I would go home, and then I would come back and build something that was supposed to last. Tonight I turned off the lamp and let the stars be enough. They thought the rule protected them from us. They were right, just not in the way they meant.